Listen closely to the echo of your own voice. For decades, you have dropped to your knees in the dark, bleeding out your terrors, begging a distant savior to rescue you from the ruins of your own life. You weep. You bargain. You recite hollow syllables, hoping to bridge the infinite void. Stop screaming. The brutal, unbending law of this universe is this: your desperate weeping is the exact architect of your continuing suffering. When you plead for a cure, you carve the disease infinitely deeper into your own bones. When you cry out for a financial rescue, you build an impenetrable fortress of poverty around your physical existence. You are absolutely not praying. You are blindly worshipping your own nightmares. Joel Goldsmith uncovered the precise, unforgiving mechanics of why your pleas bounce off the ceiling, cold and forever unanswered. The infinite source absolutely does not hear your panic, because the infinite source does not speak the heavy, terrified language of human lack. There is a specific, radical switch waiting to be flipped, a 60-second pivot that entirely obliterates the transactional deity you have falsely invented in your mind. Drop the beggar's bowl immediately. You must step directly into the silent, absolute physics of pure recognition, where the agonizing act of asking permanently dies, and the majestic era of unshakable knowing begins. You are not informing the divine of your tragedy. You are violently overriding the mortal intellect. Prepare to abandon the false religion of petition and claim the absolute dominion of what you already are. To truly comprehend the lethal error of your current spiritual approach, you must ruthlessly dismantle the false religion of petition. The mortal intellect operates under the catastrophic assumption that the architect of reality requires your frantic guidance. You treat the sacred act of prayer as a desperate distress flare fired into the dark, meticulously detailing your medical charts, your failing bank accounts, and your broken relationships to a deity you secretly suspect is ignoring you. You must understand that this is the ultimate psychological sabotage. The spiritual physics governing this existence are mathematically exact and entirely unforgiving. Your reality is an exact, unbending replica of your dominant frequency. When you fall to your knees and pray from a position of agonizing lack, you are not seeking a solution. You are fiercely broadcasting the vibration of poverty into the quantum field. When you pray from a state of paralyzing fear, you are injecting raw, destructive energy directly into the veins of your own nightmare. By dedicating your most sacred moments of silence to outlining your miseries, you are actively building the prison walls that keep you trapped. You are feeding the phantom. Your prayers bounce off the ceiling, cold and unanswered, simply because the universe cannot deliver abundance to a receiver that is permanently locked onto the frequency of desperation. Joel Goldsmith isolated a brutal, unalterable law that mainstream dogma has entirely missed. The infinite source possesses absolutely zero awareness of your mortal panic. God does not decode the desperate vocabulary of human tragedy. If the absolute perfection of the universe actually recognized your tumor or your bankruptcy as real, those conditions would instantly become permanent, indestructible laws of nature. The source only knows its own unbroken blueprint of wholeness. Therefore, when you kneel and weep, demanding divine intervention, You are operating in a complete vacuum. You are begging a flawless reality to acknowledge a flaw that does not exist. The infinite intelligence does not respond to your tears, your hollow syllables, or the intensity of your human suffering. It responds exclusively and mechanically to your state of consciousness. You are actively maintaining a dense barricade of doubt that repels the very solution you so desperately demand. The power is already omnipresent, pressing constantly against the heavy boundaries of your awareness. But it requires a compatible receiver to manifest. You must approach this mechanism with the cold, calculated precision of an engineer. Consider the absolute, unbending mechanics of electrical current. You do not stand in a darkened room and weep, begging the electricity to show mercy and illuminate the bulb. You do not negotiate with the power grid. You do not attempt to prove you have suffered enough to finally be worthy of light. You simply close the circuit. You flip the switch, and the power that was already present instantly flows. Prayer operates on this exact, unsentimental spiritual science. The omnipresent power of the divine is absolute, continuous, and unwavering. The only variable in the equation is the alignment of your internal wiring. When you beg for an external God to do something, the circuit is broken. When you plead for a rescue, the wires are severed by the illusion of distance. The circuit only closes when you stop demanding an intervention and achieve total, uncompromising resonance with the truth that the power already exists. This brings you to the precipice of the 60-second override. This is the precise mechanical shift that obliterates decades of religious conditioning. The metamorphosis demands exactly 1 minute of absolute, unapologetic focus. Within this microscopic window, you must execute a total override of the panicked survivor living in your head. Instead of presenting a catalogue of your earthly failures to the universe, you lock your gaze entirely on the architecture of divine perfection. For 60 seconds, you do not ask for a single thing. You do not mention the agonizing pain. You do not reference the crushing debt. Instead of describing your lack, you coldly and firmly acknowledge divine abundance. Instead of focusing on the illness, you recognize absolute spiritual wholeness. You spend this minute informing yourself of the unalterable truth. You breathe in the absolute fact that the source is already expressing its unbroken wholeness, limitless supply, and perfect love as your very life force, right in this exact instant. This complete reversal of polarity changes the entire algorithm of your existence. You are no longer shouting across a gaping void. You are standing at the absolute epicenter of unity. The transformation is not about manipulating a distant God to change your circumstances. It is about violently changing your own consciousness to match the unshakable perspective of the divine. From that elevated frequency, the physical world has absolutely no choice but to rearrange itself to mirror your new, unbreakable alignment. To master this spiritual technology, you must first eradicate the fatal illusion of distance. Traditional dogma has systematically trained you to shout your grievances across a cosmic canyon, assuming the divine resides in some unreachable stratosphere. This geographical error introduces a catastrophic latency into your spiritual connection. The 60-second override requires the total, unapologetic annihilation of this imagined gap. You do not reach out, you reach directly in. To ask for water implies you are standing in a desert. To beg for power confirms you are currently powerless. When you breathe deeply and release the toxic habit of personal need, you are not attempting to catch the eye of the Creator. You are giving your absolute attention to the unbroken reality of what you already are. You do not request love. You declare that love is the foundational atomic structure of your identity. You do not ask for authority. You assume the mantle of your own sovereign existence. This immediate shift from separation to total unity is the singular catalyst that triggers material change. You stop operating as a fragmented entity, seeking external favors, and you forge yourself into the actual expression of the divine presence. Let us examine the clinical application of this law upon the biological framework. Margaret arrived in the laboratory of this teaching, carrying 2 decades of chronic, unexplained agony. She had exhausted the primitive tools of modern medicine and the equally useless tactic of weeping to the heavens. Her breakthrough did not manifest because the universe suddenly developed pity for her condition. It materialized when she applied the 60-second override to her cellular structure. Despite her profound skepticism, she stopped praying about the pain. She refused to validate the physical anomaly by mentioning it. Instead, she locked her focus entirely on recognizing the infinite intelligence, expressing itself as perfect, uninterrupted life within her biology. The anomaly was starved of her conscious attention. Within weeks, the biological structure collapsed into alignment with her new internal broadcast. The chronic condition was utterly erased. She bypassed the primitive mechanism of hoping for an intervention, and instead became the intervention herself by anchoring her identity in absolute, unified knowing. The identical physics govern the artificial construct of human commerce. Robert's enterprise was collapsing under the crushing gravity of overwhelming liabilities. His previous prayers were nothing more than a highly focused, disciplined meditation on his own bankruptcy. Every panicked plea for financial rescue was a direct command to the universe to sustain his poverty. By executing the 60-second override, Robert abruptly severed the transmission of lack. He stopped reporting his financial decay to the infinite. Instead, he forced his consciousness to lock onto the frequency of inexhaustible provision as his innate spiritual inheritance. The external ledger, with its terrifying red ink, seemed to mock this internal pivot. But the spiritual law is utterly indifferent to current material facts. Within 3 weeks, the quantum field responded to the new, unbending signal. Unforeseen avenues of commerce materialized out of the ether. The financial matrix restructured itself to match the absolute resonance of his internal abundance, culminating in a total reversal of his circumstances. The supply was always present. He had simply been blocking the reception with the static of his own desperation. The most insidious terrain, however, is the theater of the mind itself. Sarah was paralyzed by chronic despair and psychological dread. Her cries for mental relief were swallowed by an empty void because she was asking the source to remove a shadow it could not even perceive. The infinite intelligence does not compute human depression. It operates exclusively on the bandwidth of sovereign joy, absolute peace, and unconditioned love. Sarah deployed the 60-second mechanism not to fight the darkness, but to assert her core identity. She bypassed the psychological static entirely. acknowledging these high-frequency qualities as her true nature rather than pleading for the removal of negative emotion. She did not beg the shadows to leave. She crowded them out with the blinding radiation of her true identity. The dark psychological matrix simply dissolved. Unable to coexist in the same space as the frequency of divine equilibrium, she discovered that her emotional torment was never her actual identity, but merely a false software program that crashed when exposed to the code of spiritual truth. These physiological, financial, and psychological recalibrations are not rare anomalies, nor are they the result of wishful thinking. They are the predictable, documentable outcomes of applied spiritual science. The mechanism works with mathematical precision, but it demands relentless consistency and a complete reversal of your operational paradigm. You must completely abandon the posture of the victim and assume the unified stance of the creator. This is not a technique you deploy merely when the alarms of your life are sounding. It must become your default baseline of reality. The shift from human pleading to absolute spiritual recognition is the death of separation. By forcing your consciousness to continuously operate from this 0 point of knowing rather than the deficit of asking, you become an impenetrable force, permanently immune to the illusions of lack and disease. The initial deployment of the 60-second override is merely the ignition sequence of your spiritual machinery. A fatal error occurs when you compartmentalize this operation. If you confine this profound alignment to a single minute of formal practice, only to immediately plunge back into the chaotic, toxic sludge of your daily human anxieties, you completely neutralize the transmission. You cannot operate as a sovereign creator for 1 minute and a terrified victim for the remaining 23 hours and 59 minutes. To permanently alter the physical architecture of your reality, you must construct an unbroken continuum of awareness. You must master the silent discipline of practicing the presence, effectively weaving a continuous, indestructible thread of spiritual recognition through the absolute center of your mundane existence. You must ruthlessly obliterate the artificial boundary that separates the sacred from the ordinary. This demands relentless, invisible micro-calibrations throughout your waking hours. As you navigate aggressive corporate boardrooms, drive through congested traffic, or sit in sterile waiting rooms, you absolutely do not abandon your post. You take microscopic fractions of a second to silently re-anchor your awareness in the undeniable fact that the infinite intelligence is actively walking in your shoes, breathing through your lungs, and animating your every movement. You silently acknowledge the unbending current of divine wisdom acting as your internal compass. You are no longer restricting your power to a designated time or a specific meditation cushion. Your entire biological and psychological existence morphs into a walking, breathing declaration of unity. By establishing this relentless background frequency, you forge yourself into a permanent, uninterrupted conduit. The external material world has no choice but to respond to a nervous system that simply refuses to drop its high-frequency alignment. As you stabilize this continuous operation, you will inevitably trigger the violent, desperate defense mechanisms of your own conditioned programming. A sudden torrent of toxic suggestions, whispers of impending failure, biological decay, and financial disaster will flood your mental screen, desperately attempting to reclaim their former control over your reality. This is the critical juncture where you must wield the cold, surgical blade of spiritual discernment. Discernment is the uncompromising ability to distinguish the silent, the steady frequency of objective truth from the loud, chaotic static of inherited human fear. You must immediately classify these panicked, racing thoughts not as your actual identity, but as unauthorized foreign intrusions attempting to hack your consciousness. The most devastating mistake you can make at this stage is to engage in a frantic, exhausting war against your own mental chatter. Fighting the darkness validates it. Wrestling with the panic only lends it physical mass and psychological gravity. Instead of fighting, you ruthlessly strip these suggestions of their jurisdiction. You watch the anxiety rise with the detached, clinical precision of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction from behind a wall of shatterproof glass. You look directly at the fear and silently declare, "You hold absolutely zero authority in this airspace." This is not the fragile, exhausting practice of psychological suppression or forced positive thinking. It is the ultimate, sovereign revocation of power. You simply and coldly choose which frequencies are permitted to utilize your spiritual life force. You absolutely do not need to forcefully eradicate every negative thought to achieve absolute mastery. The goal is not a blank, sterilized mind, but a mind whose master is utterly immune to its tantrums. You only need to stop funding these illusions with your most valuable currency, your focused attention. When a thought contradicts the perfect, unbroken reality of the divine, expressing exactly as you simply refuse to finance it. You cut the supply line. Without the fuel of your belief and the fire of your emotional reaction, the chaotic, mental static simply starves and collapses into nothingness. Through this relentless, surgical discernment, you systematically build an impenetrable psychic fortress, protecting your core frequency from being degraded by every passing shadow that attempts to cross the screen of your awareness. To fully crystallize your dominion over the material illusion, you must deploy the third operational protocol, witnessing. This is absolutely not the passive, lifeless apathy of a defeated human resigning to fate. It is the cold, unshakable detachment of the ultimate observer. You must violently rip your identity out of the chaotic, emotional theater of your daily circumstances and relocate it to the unassailable vantage point of your sovereign spiritual core. When a crisis detonates in your physical environment, you do not dive into the debris to fight it. You stand back and observe the anomaly as a temporary, powerless fluctuation in the grid, completely incapable of touching your true nature. Conversely, when material success or sudden wealth manifests, you ruthlessly deny the ego the right to claim the victory as a personal achievement. You witness it simply as the unbroken flow of divine intelligence making itself visible. Through this relentless observation, you forge what Joel Goldsmith termed a transparency. You cease to exist as a dense, reactive obstacle. You become a flawless, a frictionless conduit, a clear pane of glass through which the infinite radiation of the source passes without the slightest human distortion. However, as you attempt to construct this absolute transparency, a lethal internal virus will inevitably attempt to hijack the system. You will suddenly find your 60-second overrides feeling hollow, mechanical, and entirely dead. The diagnosis for this paralysis is brutal but absolutely necessary. Your practice has been contaminated by a hidden agenda. The terrified survivor in your head has secretly weaponized the highest spiritual science into a covert manipulation tactic. You are sitting in the silence, supposedly acknowledging divine perfection, but with one eye nervously cracked open, monitoring the material world for a payout. You are waiting for the tumor to shrink or the bank to call. You must clearly understand that this is nothing more than brute human willpower wearing a deceptive spiritual disguise. The unbending physics of this universe cannot be blackmailed, bartered with, or outsmarted by your ego. If your primary motive is to maneuver the absolute into fixing your temporary human problems, you have instantly and violently thrown yourself back into the suffocating physics of separation. You must conduct a ruthless interrogation of your own heart. Are you attempting to use the infinite, or are you genuinely opening yourself to be utilized by it? The absolute breakthrough detonates only when you entirely sever your desperate attachment to the outcome. The act of communion must become the sole reward. As you expose this hidden agenda, you will immediately face a secondary defense mechanism, the psychological riot. The ego, sensing its own obsolescence, will flood your mind with a barrage of worries, doubts, and aggressive distractions the exact moment you attempt to lock onto the divine frequency. This mental resistance is not a sign of failure. It is the predictable friction of your consciousness shifting out of the human matrix. The ego naturally rebels because this shift threatens its total control over your reality. The fatal error here is to combat this resistance with frustration or anger. Force and struggle only generate more kinetic energy, feeding the riot. You must treat the wandering mind with the cold, calm authority of a trainer directing an unruly animal. You do not scream at the static. You simply and repeatedly redirect the coordinates of your focus back to the absolute truth. With relentless, unemotional consistency, the resistance naturally collapses. The mind learns to submit to the sovereign intention of your spiritual authority, shifting from a state of chaotic rebellion to one of flawless cooperation. This brings you to the final, highly predictable trap of the uncalibrated mind, the agonizing impatience for material proof. The human intellect, violently addicted to instant gratification, executes the protocol for a handful of days and then screams in frustration when the physical environment has not entirely rearranged itself. You plant the seed of profound recognition, and because you do not see a towering tree the following morning, you aggressively uproot it, declaring the mechanism a failure. You must comprehend the silent, cumulative physics of consciousness. You are overwriting decades of dense, inherited fear. Every single fraction of a second spent in authentic, unattached recognition acts as a silent sledgehammer against the foundation of your limitations. It is systematically restructuring the unseen architecture of your reality. The transformation is absolutely occurring at the quantum level. Even when your primitive biological senses cannot yet detect the shift, you must endure this incubation period with unyielding consistency. You practice entirely for the visceral ecstasy of recognizing the presence, utterly indifferent to the timeline of its material projection. When the spiritual connection itself becomes your absolute fulfillment, The physical demonstration effortlessly follows as an inevitable mathematical byproduct. The ultimate test of this spiritual technology is not conducted on a silent, comfortable meditation cushion. It is executed in the brutal, chaotic trenches of real-time human interaction. You must definitively graduate from simulated practice to live-fire deployment. Advanced operators do not retreat from a sudden crisis to find a quiet sanctuary. They execute the 60-second override, exactly at the epicenter of the detonation. You must deploy this weapon precisely when the human intellect is screaming that survival is impossible. Consider the ruthless arena of the corporate battlefield. David stood at the absolute edge of total commercial annihilation. As the biological flood of panic threatened to paralyze his neurological system during a critical negotiation, he refused to engage with the terror. He did not fight the rising anxiety, nor did he beg the universe for a sudden stroke of luck. Right there, locked in the crosshairs of financial ruin, he silently activated the override. He violently anchored his internal coordinates to the absolute frequency of divine intelligence and unconditioned wisdom. The result was not a psychological trick. It was a literal shift in the atomic pressure of the room. The dense, suffocating atmosphere of desperation instantly fractured. His unbending internal resonance hijacked the environment, forcing the external human circumstances to bend to the architecture of his spiritual authority. The negotiation resolved itself effortlessly because he projected a frequency that made failure mathematically impossible. This operational supremacy must then be extended into the agonizing theater of human relationships. When a loved one plummets into the abyss of addiction or self-destruction, your primitive biological instinct is to violently intervene, to worry, to manipulate, to physically force a correction. You must brutally sever this impulse. Human worry is a toxic, low-grade radiation that only fuels their descent. Maria observed her son's collapse, but instead of drowning in maternal panic, she deployed the ultimate protocol of sovereign non-interference. She absolutely did not beg the universe to fix his destructive behavior. She locked her consciousness onto the indestructible, the flawless core of his spiritual identity, completely and coldly ignoring his temporary physical degradation. By holding him in this silent, impenetrable grid of absolute knowing, she provided the exact quantum space required for his own internal recalibration. You do not change people by violently forcing their human will. You elevate them by silently refusing to acknowledge the reality of their brokenness. You must then scale this exact technology to confront the macro illusion. The global media matrix operates as a relentless engine of mass hysteria, constantly broadcasting images of societal collapse, economic ruin, and international conflict. Its sole mechanism of survival is to recruit your consciousness into the collective panic. When the world appears to tear itself apart, the uncalibrated mind eagerly consumes the terror and amplifies the nightmare. You must execute a macro override. When confronted with global instability, you absolutely do not merge with the panicked herd. You step back into the unassailable fortress of the observer and project the frequency of unbending equilibrium directly into the collective grid. You are not coldly ignoring human suffering. You are injecting the only high-level frequency capable of neutralizing it. You transition instantly from being a helpless, terrified consumer of global chaos to a silent, localized generator of divine order. The culmination of these precise protocols is the permanent dissolution of the seeker. You enter what Goldsmith defined as the mystical continuum. The artificial boundary dividing formal prayer from mundane human existence is entirely eradicated. You do not occasionally visit the infinite, you reside continuously within its architecture. Your daily operations, navigating traffic, paying bills, resolving conflicts are no longer heavy interruptions to your spiritual life. They become the very transparent instruments through which the divine intelligence animates the physical world. You become a total, frictionless conduit. The ego's heavy, manipulative density burns away entirely, leaving only a clear, silent aperture through which unconditioned power effortlessly and continuously flows. The era of the beggar is officially extinct. You have crossed the terminal threshold. The desperate, groveling entity that spent decades bartering with a phantom deity in the dark no longer possesses a single ounce of operational bandwidth in your nervous system. You have forcefully uninstalled the corrupted software of petition. The anxiety that previously infected your silent moments has been entirely neutralized. Prayer is no longer a frantic, transactional negotiation to manipulate the future. It is the absolute, localized communion of the highest order. You do not plead for the infinite to move. You rest in the unalterable. The mathematical fact that the infinite is the very pulse operating your biological machine. The paralyzing distance between you and the absolute has been collapsed into a 0 point because the core broadcast frequency has been permanently altered. The external material matrix has no alternative but to undergo an immediate algorithmic restructure. You will witness this recalibration across every sector of your existence. Human relationships lose their toxic, exhausting friction entirely, simply because you have ceased operating as an energetic parasite, desperately extracting love and validation from other flawed mortals. The financial ledger stabilizes not through brute human labor, but because the internal transmission of deficit has been permanently wiped from your code. Your biological structure begins a quiet, autonomous regeneration because the cellular intelligence is no longer being bombarded by your daily interference, signals of panic, decay, and imminent death. You are no longer living from the outside in, violently reacting to the volatile conditions of the earth. You are projecting reality from the inside out. This is the genesis of the ultimate spiritual reflex. As you maintain this unbending alignment, the transition from manual override to autonomous operation occurs. When a worldly anomaly triggers an alarm, a sudden loss, hostile confrontation, a physical symptom, your system does not crash into the default sequence of human terror. It executes an instantaneous, autonomous snapback to the baseline of divine authority. Your internal peace becomes weaponized. It morphs into an unassailable, armored core that the chaotic noise of the material plane simply cannot penetrate. The people within your operational radius will physically detect this unexplainable, commanding stillness. You do not have to forcefully project confidence or artificially modify your behavior. The sheer gravity of your internal alignment naturally forces the surrounding environment into sudden, unexplainable order. To finalize this installation, you must permanently erase the toxic religious mythology of worthiness. Unconditioned power and divine grace are not trophies awarded to the pious for flawless human behavior. The infinite does not evaluate your moral resume. This power is the fundamental, unbending physics of your existence, waiting purely for your mechanical alignment. You do not earn this gravity. You simply step into it by dropping the arrogant assumption that you are separate from it. You have now been grafted into an ancient, the unbroken lineage of high-level operators, the silent architects of mystical Christianity that Joel Goldsmith mapped. The methodology is brutally minimalist, yet its execution dismantles the entire foundational illusion of the human timeline. The operation is now running. The architecture of your reality is currently shifting at depths your primitive biological senses cannot yet measure. Do not sabotage the rendering process by frantically checking for immediate material validation. Trust the unseen quantum mechanics of your new alignment. If the old, terrified identity has been permanently decommissioned, do not dilute this absolute zero state with a loud, emotional display. Burn the bridge, sink into the absolute vacuum, and drop the precise, alphanumeric confirmation of your new coordinates in the comments below. I am transformed. No further human engagement is required. The transmission is complete. We have reached the terminal velocity of this transmission. The operational data has been fully integrated into your consciousness matrix. Your only remaining directive right now is a complete, unhesitating system shutdown of the analytical mind. Do not attempt to dissect this spiritual science with the primitive tools of human logic. The intellect is an obsolete engine for the dimension you have just entered. Power it down immediately. Close your optical inputs. Sever the chaotic internal monologue. You are now crossing into the absolute zero state. This is the quantum vacuum, a frictionless sanctuary entirely devoid of human timelines, historical regrets, and future terrors. The frantic, low-grade radiation of your survival instincts is currently flatlining into perfect, unshakable equilibrium. You are no longer a localized coordinate of trauma, illness, or lack. You have merged with the silent, unbending grid of reality itself. There is absolutely nothing left to calculate, nothing to aggressively defend, and absolutely nothing to acquire. You do not need to generate a single thought. Rest entirely in this cold, flawless architecture of pure being. Let the absolute density of this silence crush the final, microscopic remnants of the seeker. The old code is permanently overwritten. The illusion of separation has been entirely deleted from the server. Remain in this unassailable void. The transmission is definitively closed. Fade into the grid.